joining. All right. As a reminder, we had regularly scheduled to do the SBSA, the MCA, and the WDA, which I really think was supposed to be the WFDA because I don't think there is any WDA form. So I think it was supposed to be the WFDA, the Wildfire Disaster Advisory. So we'll be touching base on that today as well. But we're going to finish up the RLAS from last week. So we only got through section 19 or to section 19. So we're going to pick up where we left off on that. And as a reminder, well, before I get started, two things. Number one, if you have questions, you can throw them in the chat box. You can raise your little hand there on your Zoom window and I'll see it, or you can just unmute yourself and say, hey, question before you go on. Totally okay. Any of those interactions works great. So that's how to interact with me today. And I am working on the new schedule for Q2, which is April, May, June. So I'm working on that today or this week to have that finalized. So if there's anything that you would like on that schedule, make sure you log your attendance today and put it in the suggestions. I've got a list of suggestions from the previous logs. So we always try to work those in. So any trainings that you want to see coming up, throw those in there and we'll get them posted. And then also special announcement, and you, 4 of you are the first to hear it. I will be in town on the 5th of April. So it's the Friday after Easter. Okay, so not Good Friday, but fun. I will be in town. I believe I'm going to be doing a training in office on that day, covering how to structure your 12-week year. So how to review your goals for the second quarter, how to pick those, and how to set yourself up for success in Q2. So that will be in office on April 5th. I don't have a time yet for that. So I will be in town on that day. I may also try to squeeze in maybe on the same day an in-person AVID training. So in case you haven't done an AVID yet and you'd like to see that in person, last time I was in town or the time before that, we did one as well. So I may try to roll that in on the same day. So just a couple opportunities there in case you don't get to interact with me on a personal level in person very often. There's your opportunities. Anastasia?
How long are you going to be in town?
That has yet to be determined. I'm supposed to be in town until the 9th, but I may leave on the night of the 5th or the 6th and fly to St. Louis because my family is all gathering in St. Louis to watch the eclipse.
Okay, we'll talk offline.
So I should know by tomorrow whether I'm staying in Sacramento or whether I am flying to St. Louis. I'll let you know.
Okay, and we'll make arrangements.
Okay. So we got that coming on. And then next week, there's some changes as well. So Monday next week, we are not going to have class. Tuesday will be as scheduled, and Wednesday will also be as scheduled next week. But I have coach up training through Realty One Group to get certified as an official ROG coach. So I have that on Monday and Wednesday, but Wednesday we have a guest anyway, so they'll be running that meeting. And then Mondays we're going to cancel. So just a heads up for next week. We are supposed to be covering the contingency for sale of buyer's property and the cancellation of contract forms next week. Those will get bumped to like the second week of April. So just a heads up on that. So that's what we have coming up. That's what you have in store.
And no class this Thursday. Correct?
No class on Wednesday.
Wednesday or Thursday.
We never have class on Thursday.
Oh, okay. That's good.
But what's on Thursday?
Nothing.
Oh, yeah. So no class on Wednesday this week because it's the ROG office meeting. ROG fall.
Are you able to do trainings on Thursday next quarter?
Maybe. Would you prefer?
I never get to them because I'm busy.
Busy. I may put out maybe I'll put out another survey and get people to weigh in on what times are ideal again, and I may change them up just a little bit. So we'll see. You never know. Maybe.
Okay.
All right. All right, but let's hop in to our seller license to remain in possession. Remember, this is for intended for possessions of 30 days. Oh, this is the wrong form. This is the SIP form. I don't know why it pulled this one up. It should be the, sorry, the RLAS. I've got the wrong form. Hold on. We're going to take that one away. Goodbye. It should be the RLAS, the residential lease after sale. I was like, that says 29 days or less. It should not say that. We're going to take this and drag it up there. All right, there we go. Residential lease after sale. That's the one that we stopped off on. That is for any sellers that remain in possession for 30 days or more. Deborah, question?
Yeah, before you get started on this,
Yeah.
it doesn't relate to this, but is there anything that says exactly what time the sellers or the buyers can take possession? I know it's
Yeah.
like, it's closed when it's recorded, right?
Yeah, so that's the, so if we look at, hold on, let me pull up the residential purchase agreement. Hold on, just gonna add it in here. I think I say this every time. I'm always like, I should always just throw this RPA in here because we always reference it. So on the residential purchase agreement, if we go to the grid, hold on. It's got angry at me for adding too many forms.
I'm running into a situation where they're gonna close concurrently
Uh-huh.
and trying to figure out how they're gonna actually move out exactly when they close.
Yeah, so that's always right. That's trying to do that balance of a close concurrently. There's a couple of options there. Number one is your sellers could have everything packed up and ready to go in the moving truck the day before. Just camp out in the house the day of and then head over to the other house, assuming they close concurrently. We should be able to get keys about the same time. So that's one method that we do. The other method, and the previous purchase contract before they updated it to the grid, used to always be that the possession time was like at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock on the date of the close of escrow, which means the sellers often, almost always, 99.8% of the time, stayed in possession of the property after the close of escrow. So there was always kind of this like weird thing that happened there because, once you close, it's really the buyer's house, but then the sellers weren't leaving until 5 or 6. Usually we get notice of recording like by 1 o'clock in the afternoon, oftentimes at the latest, sometimes 3, but usually it's closer to 1. So when they updated the purchase agreement to this current one that we have, that's where it says here, the time of possession is upon notice of recordation. That's the default. So the default is as soon as we get notice that that property has been recorded, the buyers or the sellers should be out of that property and the buyers are allowed to have keys at that time. Okay, the workaround for that, Deborah, is that you could do a modification of terms. For this, well, you do an AEA, you do an amendment to the existing agreement, and you would request of the buyers to allow the seller to remain in possession on the date of the close of escrow until 6 p.m. or 8 p.m. That would give you some hours of overlap as both properties record that they can be in the house still while they facilitate finalizing the moving process. So that would be the easiest way is if you could get the buyers to agree to that. That way you're not doing like a whole seller in possession. You're not doing anything like that. You're just saying, hey, we just want a few more hours. Can we have a few more hours?
So you could even change on that. You could even say, or 12 midnight if you wanted to, as long as everybody would sign it.
Yeah, I would do 11:59 p.m. so it stays on the date of the close of escrow. Otherwise, if we roll to the next day, so if we go like 12 o'clock or 12:01, now we've rolled to the day after the close of escrow, you really should have a SIP form that the sellers can stay in possession for 1 day after the close of escrow.
Okay, so anything over 1 day, you should have a SIP.
Yeah, you should have a SIP, but as long as it's on the day of recording. In the future, if you know the properties are going to close concurrently, a good way to do that would be to edit this M1 line to be where instead of the default notice of recordation to check the box for 6 p.m. or specify, 11:59 p.m. on the date specified.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question though, because that is a definite issue when you've got sellers that are selling to purchase another property and they're supposed to close on the same day or at the same time. Oftentimes I'll always ask for like a SIP of 3 days in that situation. just to facilitate any hiccups that might happen. Like we're supposed to close on the same day, but if something happens and the wire gets trapped and never makes it to the title company for the other funds, or something happens and it doesn't close the same day, if we negotiate in that SIP for 3 days, just to make sure that the sellers aren't homeless for 24 hours or 48 hours, that 3-day time period. Most
Right.
buyers will agree to it, and it just gives you that buffer room. But if you don't have that, just ask for a few more hours on the date of the close out.
And because there's no way of doing it on the opposite end, right? Where the house they're purchasing, they can't do anything 3 days early.
Yeah, absolutely. So if it's a vacant house, or the buyers or the sellers of that house are going to be out early, you could negotiate in. There's a form for that called the buyer in possession prior to the close of escrow. It's an early occupancy agreement. So let me find that form for you.
And that would be covered like with homeowners insurance and.
Yeah, you would probably want your buyers then to contact whoever their homeowners insurance is going to be through, and let them know that, hey, we're going to rent that property from the sellers for 3 days prior to the close of escrow. We'd like a rental policy in place for those 3 days. And then the sellers remain with their homeowners insurance for those 3 days. But yeah, that would be the way to do that one.
And could you do it without funds? If
You
that's,
can.
yeah, okay. And it would be the buyers in possession form?
Yeah, the interim occupancy agreement.
Interim
It's it doesn't have my acronym.
IOA. No.
No, I think it's I don't know. I'll tell you here in a second. It's trying to add it, but I can't pull up when I hover over it. It doesn't give me the acronym. So just a second, I'll pull that up, because this is a great question to have, right? Like,
Yeah, I'm in
how
a
do we
really
work with this?
sticky situation right now with that because
Yeah.
the
And
buyers
there's
don't, yeah.
yeah, and there's actually 2 options too. So we have this buyer in possession prior to the close of escrow document that you can do, where the buyers get full occupancy of the property. There's also a storage addendum that you can do, where it gives the permission for the buyers to store stuff in the garage. So that gives them the ability to
Oh, that's even better. Yeah.
So right. So if the sellers, this would be like the ideal, because then they can go in there and get the property clean. They can start moving stuff in. They don't have to like unload it to the garage and then unload it to the house 3 days later.
Mhm.
But if the seller doesn't agree to this one, then the other one is there's a storage addendum, which allows the buyer to store things in the garage prior to the close of escrow. So that's the next best option, because then they can move things out and move it into the garage. They're not actually taking possession of the house. They don't have free run. They just have the ability to put stuff in that garage. So those are kind of your 2 occupancies. So this one's it's an IOA form. The interim occupancy is the IOA.
That's actually
Yeah.
perfect. IOA.
Yeah.
And then the seller gets a renter policy for the amount of days that they're allowed. And we can close concurrently. Easy. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. The other one is that buyer pre-occupancy storage addendum that allows them to store things on the property, but not occupy the property. So those are your 2 options there. I don't know why it doesn't give me the acronym. The POSA is the pre-occupancy storage addendum. Yep. We don't talk about those forms very often. That's probably something that I should put on Q2 on the forms to make sure that we cover these 2 forms, because these are great forms to utilize when you're in a pinch like this, especially. All right. Residential lease after sale, again, 30 days or more. We're going to pick up in section 19. This is a really long form. This is why I'm always like, hey, keep it to the SIP. Like, don't give them a possession longer than 29 days, because then we've got the SIP and it's 2 pages versus like 23 pages. I think it's only 8, but still 8's a lot. So entry, right? So this works, and I covered this last week, but again, the RLAS functions just like a regular like month-to-month listing agreement, except that it's specific for a residential lease after sale, where the sellers are staying in possession. We're not putting new tenants in there. So the tenant shall make permits available. I'm going to cover, I'll just like brief over the ones that don't have options or that don't really apply, but But the entry one, tenant shall make premise available to housing provider or housing provider's representative for the purpose of entering to make necessary or agreed to repairs, including but not limited to installing, repairing, testing, maintaining smoke detectors and carbon monoxide devices, bracing, anchoring, or strapping water heaters, and repairing dilapidation related to the presence of mold, providing decorations, alterations, or improvements, or supplying necessary agreed to services, or to show premise to prospective or actual purchasers, tenants, mortgagees, lenders, appraisers, contractors, and other collectively interested persons. Really, so really truly for like any reason, basically, except just to harass the tenant. Tenant agrees that housing provider, broker, and interested persons may take photos of the premise. Housing provider and tenant agree that 24-hour written notice shall be reasonable and sufficient notice, except as follows. So, right, so 24-hour notice is what's required to view that, to enter that property. 48 is necessary to conduct an inspection of the premise prior to the tenant moving out, unless tenant waives the right to such notice. That'd be like a move out inspection. That does 48 hours. Notice, if housing provider has in writing, inform tenant the premise are for sale, tenant will be notified orally to show premise. That's the NSE form. Then for the next 120 days following the delivery of the NSE, notice may be given orally to show the premise to actual or prospective purchasers. So that's oral notice instead of written notice. It's still 24-hour notice. No written notice is required if housing provider and tenant orally agree to an entry for agreed services or repairs, if the date and time of entry are within 1 week of the oral agreement. So if we make an agreement that something's going to be repaired, 24 hours isn't necessary, or no written notice. It's still 24-hour notice is necessary, but it can be an oral notice that, hey, they're going to be there on this day and this time. No notice is required to enter in case of emergency. If tenant is present and consents at time of entry, or if the tenant has abandoned or surrendered the premise, okay? And then we check this box here for C. The tenant authorizes the use of a key safe lockbox to allow entry to the premise and agrees to a signed key safe lockbox. That's car form KLA. So if the property is being listed either for sale or for lease, and you're going to put a sign in the yard or a lockbox on the property for those viewings, then we're going to check this box C, and we're going to include that additional KLA form. So it's not uncommon that oftentimes with longer rent backs, it's an investor that's purchased the property for the purpose of renting it out, and they want that property occupied. So they may want to complete repairs prior to the tenant, the seller moving out, or they may want to start showing that property. So when the seller moves out on the 25th, it can be occupied on the 1st again. So we may start showing that ahead of time. So those are kind of the entry rules. Photographs and internet advertising. It's just saying that, hey, like we're allowed to take photographs and advertise the property on the internet. Okay, so that's that section 20. Signs, tenant authorized housing provider to place for sale or lease signs on premise. Okay, assignment or subletting. Tenant shall not sublet any part of the premise, right? So this is like, hey, we're authorizing you to stay in the property and nobody else. You can't like move out today and let somebody else stay in there for a week because you had an extra week of rent back and make some money off somebody. That's not the option. It's used for whoever we identified on page 1 of this form and them only. This prohibition also applies to short-term vacation and transient rentals, such as, but not limited to, those arranged through Airbnb, VRBO, HomeAway, or other short-term rental services. Any violation of this prohibition is non-curable material breach of this agreement. You can kick them out immediately if they violate that. So if the property was also or set up as an Airbnb already, we may want to check this box that it does not apply to short-term rentals. So if they're already renting that out and they've got prospective people coming to stay in that property during the seller in possession time, then we would need to know that ahead of time, and you'd want to check that box that those people can stay. For the most part, it's not going to apply. Most of the time, it's the seller's in possession, not short-term rental type situation. So it's also a prohibition that applies to those type of short-term rentals. So we don't check this box. Any questions on 19, 20, 21, or 22? All right. Joint and individual obligations, more than one tenant, each one shall individually and completely be responsible for the performance of all obligations. So it's just saying that, hey, like If there's only one seller listed on the contract, but there's multiple tenants, because we said, you know, immediate family, they're all responsible to uphold the contract. Tenant's obligations upon vacating premise, this is really important. Upon termination of this agreement, tenant shall give housing provider all copies of all keys and opening devices to premise, including any common areas. Vacate and surrender premise to housing provider empty of all persons and personal property belonging to tenant. Vacate any all parking and or storage spaces. Clean and deliver premise as specified in paragraph C to the housing provider in the same condition referenced in paragraph 10V or 10. That is, if we go back up to 10, right here, condition of premise just says that, hey, it's, you know, if there was something that wasn't working, that's totally fine, but everything should be an operable condition. Okay, scrolling back down. Removal debris, so that's trash, right? Dog poo, fallen trees, that all falls underneath there unless the tree had been fallen before. Give written notice to housing provider of tenant's forwarding address, and there's a blank line. So if there's something else you want there, maybe you negotiated or you want to negotiate that the house be professionally clean, this is where you would put that into this contract. Okay, so just throwing that out there. Otherwise, it's not. It's just the same as it is on the contract. It should be in the same condition as on the date of acceptance. If there's something that is working, it should still be working. And they should remove the property of all persons, personal belongings, and trash, basically. Okay, so just kind of keep that in mind. So if they're staying in it for an extended period of time, you want it professionally cleaned, put it in there that the buyers to pay for, you know, house should be professionally cleaned. Okay. Any alterations, improvements made or caused to be made by tenant with or without housing provider's consent become the property of the housing provider upon termination. Housing provider may charge tenant for restoration of the premise to the condition it was prior to any alterations or improvements. The right to a pre-move out inspection and repairs as follows. After giving and receiving notice of termination of tenancy, that'd be an NTT, or before the expiration of this agreement, tenant has the right to request an inspection of the premise take place prior to the termination, the CAR form NRI. If tenant requests such inspection, tenant shall be given an opportunity to remedy identified deficiencies prior to termination. Consent with the terms of this agreement. Any repairs, alterations made to the premise as a result of this inspection, collectively repairs shall be made at the tenant's expense. Repairs may be performed by tenant or through others who have adequate insurance and licenses and are approved by the housing provider. The work shall comply with applicable law, including governmental permit, inspection, and approval requirements. Repairs shall be performed in good, skillful manner with materials of quality and appearance comparable to existing materials. It is understood that the exact restoration of appearance or cosmetic items following all repairs may not be possible, right? Like the texture may not match exactly, or the color of paint may not match because the wall may have faded and we use the same color paint that might be a little darker. It is tenant shall obtain receipts for repairs performed by others, prepare a written statement indicating repairs performed by tenant and the date of such repairs, and provide copies of receipts and statements to housing provider prior to termination. Paragraph 24C does not apply when the tenancy is terminated pursuant to California Code Civil Procedure 1161, 2, 3, or 4. Okay. So they can remember, we learned up in paragraph 19 that if they were going to do a pre-move out inspection, it's a 48-hour notice for that. They have 2 days to prepare for that one, and they should be given time to remedy any items that are identified in that before the termination of their agreement. So you have to give adequate time. If they just move out, you do the inspection, then it is what it is. You just make the notes and identify those items that you may want to withhold part of their security deposit for. Breach of contract, early termination, in addition to obligations established by paragraph 24. In the event of termination by tenant prior to completion of the original term of the agreement or any extension, tenant shall also be responsible for lost rent, rental commissions, advertising expenses, and painting costs necessary to ready the premise for re-rental. Housing provider may withhold such amounts from tenant security deposit, right? So them leaving early doesn't necessarily constitute they're going to get money back. So just kind of be if they're early termination. Temporarily relocation, right? So if there's fumigation or something, right? It's unhospitable conditions, then the housing provider can relocate the tenants temporarily to like a hotel or whatever during that process. Damage to the premise. If by no fault of tenant, premise are totally or partially destroyed by fire, earthquake, accident, or casualty that render premise totally or partially uninhabitable, either housing provider or tenant may terminate this agreement by giving the other written notice. Rent shall be abated as of the date premises became totally or partially uninhabitable. The abated amount shall be the current monthly rent prorated on a 30-day period. If the agreement is not terminated, housing provider shall promptly repair the damage and rent shall be reduced based on the extent to which the damage interferes with tenant's reasonable use of property, a premise. If damage occurs as a result of an act of the tenant or tenant's guest, or only housing provider shall have the right of termination and no reduction in rent shall be made. Okay, insurance. Here's where it's talking about the fact that they should have insurance. Tenants, guests, invitees, personal property are not covered by the housing provider. Tenant is advised to carry their own rental policy, right? And if the housing provider wants the tenant to have liability insurance, they would check this box in 28C and put in the amount here of how much. Maybe it's 100,000, right? Naming the housing provider and, if applicable, property manager as the additional insured for injury or damage to or upon the premise during the term of this agreement or any extension. Okay. Water beds, portable washers. Tenant shall not use or have water beds on the premise except if tenant obtains a valid waterbed insurance policy. Tenant increases the security deposit amount equal to 1/2 of 1 month's rent, and the bed conforms to the floor load capacity of premise. Keep in mind that we're talking seller in possession after the close of escrow. So if they have a waterbed, they have one. So we want to make sure that they have the waterbed insurance policy on their renter's insurance. Okay. Tenant shall not use on the premise a portable dishwasher or portable washing machine. Again, you're going to know because it's already going to be there for the most part. So if it's not a built-in dishwasher or a regular laundry room where there's a washer and dryer, then they may have a portable washing machine. That's one that like hooks up to your kitchen sink or to like a utility sink, and it runs that way. The reason that this has the tenant shall not use those is because those tend to more often than not leak and cause problems. So for the most part, you're not going to need to check these, but if the house already has a portable dishwasher or a portable washing machine, you may want to check those. Waiver of any breach shall not be construed as containing a continuing waiver of the same or subsequent breach. Okay, so if we said, hey, we told you not to use a portable dishwasher, you're using one, please discontinue use. Saying, hey, we're not going to kick you out for using that. Isn't there a green light to continue using that portable dishwasher? You're going to fill in the buyer's buyer's information here. That's the housing provider. That's the new landlord, on how they can be contacted or where notices may be served. So an address, and then the tenant. This information goes here. Usually that's going to be the property address, but double check. The tenant estoppel certificate. Tenant shall execute and return a tenant estoppel certificate delivered by tenant to housing provider or housing provider's agent within 3 days after its receipt. Car form TEC. Failure to comply with this requirement shall be deemed tenant's acknowledgement that the tenant estoppel certificate is true and correct and may be relied upon by lender or purchaser. So that's another form that you would include with this one. It just outlines what's included in the rent, so we make sure we have a full understanding. I don't know that I've ever included a tenant estoppel certificate anytime I've done an RLAS, but technically it should be. Mediation. We're just saying, hey, consistent with paragraphs B and C, they agree to mediate any disputes. Okay. Attorney fees in any action proceeding or arising out of this agreement, the prevailing party between the housing provider and tenant shall be entitled to reasonable attorney fees and costs, collectively not to exceed $1,000, except as provided in Form 33A, which is there. Attorney car form means the right. We're just definition of what a car form is because it mentions car form in several spots. Statutory disclosures, it automatically includes the mold and dampness disclosure. Exposure to mold may have potential health risks. tenant acknowledges receipt of the attached book titled Information on Dampness and Mold for Renters in California before signing this RLAS agreement. Lead-based paint, if it was built before 1978, make sure to provide them with that booklet. They probably already provided it to you as part of the transaction. It should be on that NHD report, but give it back to them. Periodic pest control. So if there's going to be periodic pest control on the property, we would want to check this box C1 or 2. Tenant premise is a house, tenant is responsible for periodic pest control, or housing provider has entered into a contract for periodic pest control, or if neither apply, we don't have a contract going for periodic pest control, we just don't check anything. Okay, if there was a notice issued by a health official as an order prohibiting occupancy of the property because of methamphetamine contamination, we would check this box here. Okay, probably not going to happen. Bed bugs, there's probably a form attached to this, the attached bed bug disclosure, because that's required for all tenants. Super exciting stuff. You've got your Megan's Law database disclosure. Same thing here is what's in the residential purchase agreement, that they can go to the website and look up any sex offenders in the area. You've got your residential environmental hazards booklet. We would check that box. Again, that's something that's included as part of the NHD that was already part of this transaction as part of the purchase transaction. Just kick it back to them to make sure they get a copy of it. Military ordinance disclosure, if applicable and known by housing provider, premise are located within 1 mile of an area once used for a military training and may contain potentially explosive munitions. I'll get there eventually. That would have been in that NHD report that was part of the purchase and sale transaction. So you can look at that for whether that box needs to be checked. Flood hazard disclosure. The flooding has a potential to cause significant damage. See attached tenant flood hazard disclosure for additional information. Death on premise, unless otherwise disclosed, buyer, housing provider has no additional information than what the seller or tenant already provided. There's one that finally makes sense. And then other material facts that the tenant should be aware of would be marked there. So maybe like the buyer during the purchase process had the property tested for radon and it came back positive for radon, but the seller had no idea previous, we may want to mark there. And then the property tested at, 0.32 parts per million of radon gas in property, right? So we would want to disclose that there. I don't know how it's reported on radon. Generally in California, it's not a huge issue of naturally occurring radon. In other states it is. Service Members Civil Relief Act, notwithstanding to the contrary, paragraphs 254, 256, or elsewhere in this agreement. I feel like this is not an accurate number, but we'll just continue on. It's probably supposed to be 25 and 26. I have no idea. The Service Members Relief Act applies to this agreement. Any effort to terminate it as specified in 2951 and 2955 of the Act. That just is like, hey, if the service member gets PCS to another location sooner than what this agreement terminates, they have the right to terminate early termination, or if they're getting deployed. Time is of the essence, entire agreement. Just saying that, hey, this agreement is in full. Same thing that you'd find here in the purchase agreement. If any provision in this agreement is to be held ineffective or invalid, the remaining provisions will nonetheless be given full force and effect. Neither this agreement nor any provision may be extended, amended, modified, altered, or changed except in writing. Everything has to be in writing. This agreement and any support, addendum, or modification, including any copy, may be signed in 2 or more counterparts, all of which be construed as one and the same as writing, which means that one party could sign one document, the other one might sign a copy of it. As long as they're exactly the same, it counts as both parties signing. Here's where you would put housing providers, firm information, tenant's brokerage firm, that would be the seller's information, seller's brokerage information. If the term of the agreement exceeds 1 year, disclosure regarding real estate agency relationship has been provided to the housing provider by tenant. So you would check that box only if it's going to exceed 1 year. Termination of agency relationship. Housing provider and tenant acknowledge and agrees that unless broker is the property manager or unspecified in 2 below, once this agreement commences on the close of escrow, Broker, it will not represent owner in any manner regarding any of the management of the premise and any representation duties that the broker may owe to, and any agency relationships that the broker may have with either the housing provider or the tenant is terminated, right? So our job as their agent ends on the date of the close of escrow. They are responsible for this after that. That doesn't mean that we can't help them with forms or whatever they might need. It's just not, we don't represent them any further as far as that goes. Okay, that's the same thing too with the seller in possession. We usually still help facilitate the possession and different things, but it's truly not in as part of our agency duty. Notice of right to receive foreign translation of lease rental agreements. They speak a different language. Receipts, acknowledge if specified in paragraph 4 or 5, that's like the funds up front, housing provider or broker acknowledge receipt of those funds. Other terms and conditions are attached. So if there's anything else you would like to include, keep in mind here, you can't uncheck the bed bug disclosure, the tenant flood hazard disclosure, or the rent cap and just cause addendum. All those are included and have to be included. Other documents or addendum attached, we can check that box and fill that out. Legally authorized signer, right? Whenever the signatures of the legally authorized signer identified in paragraph 46 or 47 appear on this agreement, any related documents, it shall be deemed to be in a representative capacity for the entity described and not in an individual capacity unless otherwise indicated, right? Same idea as what you'd see on the residential purchase agreement or your listing agreement. If they have an interpreter or a translator, we would check this box here. We would fill out the language here for that. And there's an attached form that gets added. The premise is being managed by owner is the default here on 45. If they're going to have us manage it or a property manager manage it, then you would check the box. Housing providers brokerage firm in the real estate brokerage section. We would check that box and fill out which section that is. It's going to be either 45 or 46, I believe. Let's see, tenant section, housing provider's signature. No. Real estate, it would be down here in this section. So that would be section 47, technically. Property management firm, immediately below, you would list the property management firm there. Okay. Housing provider and tenant acknowledge and agrees that brokers do not guarantee the condition of the premise, cannot verify representations made by others, cannot provide legal or tax advice, will not provide other advice or information that exceeds our knowledge, education, or experience. Not just our knowledge, education, but the knowledge, education, and experience required to obtain a real estate license. So it goes beyond what we may know more, but only it's supposed to use our knowledge as it pertains to our real estate license. Furthermore, if brokers are also not acting as housing provider in this agreement, brokers do not decide what rental rate a tenant should pay or a housing provider should accept, and do not decide upon the length or the terms of this agreement. Housing provider and tenant agree that they will seek legal, tax, insurance, and other desired assistance from appropriate professionals. Okay, tenant and seller agrees to rent the premise on the terms and conditions above. Entity tenant, so if the tenant, the seller was an entity like an LLC, trust, whatever, we would check that box there, fill it out just like we would on the RPA, and then the tenant signs down here. Same thing here, this is the housing provider or the buyer, owner or agent for the owner, right? Agrees to rent the premise on the above terms and conditions. If it's an entity, we check the box for A. If it's just a regular buyer, they just fill out their information down here on B. Okay, then the brokerages fill out their information here. Real estate brokers who are also not housing provider under this agreement are not parties to the agreement between housing provider, buyer, and tenant/seller. Agency relationships are confirmed in paragraph 29. Cooperating broker compensation, unless otherwise agreed, compensation for this RLAS is included in any compensation received from the purchase of real property described in this agreement, or check this box, the amount specified on a separate written agreement between housing providers broker and tenants broker. So if we are negotiating additional funds for negotiating this RLAS, we would check that box. Otherwise, it's just part of the purchase and sale. Any questions on the last 4 pages of this RLAS? Sections 19 through 47. I bored so many people, they left. All right, so we're all good. We're going to continue on there to the next form. Everybody good with that? Okay, we've got the market conditions advisory form, the MCA form. I usually send out this form with every offer that I have signed and every listing agreement that I get signed. And you're like, Amy, why would you do that? Well, because it's the market conditions advisory. And I think it's an important form that gets provided before they sign that RLA or the RLA, the residential listing agreement, or your RPA, your residential purchase agreement, because it outlines that ultimately they're responsible for what they decide to offer on the property or what they decide to list that property for. So it talks about the market conditions in the beginning. Real estate markets are cyclical and can change over time. It is impossible to predict the future market conditions with accuracy. In a competitive or hot real estate market, there are generally more buyers than sellers. This will often lead to multiple buyers competing for the same property. As a result, in order to make their offers more attractive, some buyers may offer more than originally planned or eliminate certain contingencies in their offers. In a less competitive or cool market, there are generally more sellers than buyers, often causing real estate prices to level off or drop, sometimes precipitously. The sales price of the home being sold as foreclosures and short sales is difficult to anticipate and can affect the value of other homes in the area. Brokers, appraisers, sellers, and buyers take these distressed property sales and listings into consideration when valuing property. In light of the real estate market's cyclical nature, it's important that the buyer understands the potential for little or no appreciation in the value or an actual loss in the value of the property they purchase. This advisory discusses some of the potential risks inherent in changing market conditions. Right? Buyer considerations, offering price. As a buyer, you are responsible for determining the price you want to offer for a property. If I provide them this MCA after we've already made the offer, what's the point, right? So that's why I do it ahead of time. Although brokers may provide you with comparable sales data, generally from information published in the local MLS, you should know that reporting this data is often delayed and prices may change up or down faster than reported sales indicate. All buyers should be sure that they are comfortable with the price they are offering or the price they are accepting in a counter offer. You should be aware of and think of the following. If your offer is accepted, the property's value may not increase and may even decrease. If your offer is accepted, you may have buyer's remorse that you paid too much. If your offer is rejected, there can be no guarantee that you will find a similar property at the same price. And if your offer is rejected, you may not be satisfied that the amount you offered was right for you. Only you can determine that your offer was reasonable and prudent in light of the property and your circumstances. Non-contingent offers. Most residential purchase agreements contain contingencies allowing a buyer within a specified period of time to cancel a purchase if the buyer cannot obtain a loan, is dissatisfied with the property's condition after an inspection, or if the property does not appraise at a certain value. To make their offers more attractive, buyers will sometimes write offers with few or no contingencies or offer to remove contingencies within a short period of time. In a hot market, sellers will sometimes insist that buyers write offers with no contingencies. Broker recommends that buyers do not write non-contingent offers, and if you do so, you are acting against the advice of brokers. However, if you do write a non-contingent offers, these are some of the contractual rights that you may be giving up. Your loan contingency, your appraisal contingency, and your investigation contingency. See why this one's so important? There is an inherent risk to writing a non-contingent offer. Only you, after careful consideration and deliberation with your attorney, accountant, and financial advisor, can decide how much risk you are willing to take on. It is your decision alone and cannot be made by your broker or your real estate agent. Broker recommendations. Broker recommends that you do not write a non-contingent offer, even if you are planning on paying all cash for the property. If you do intend to write a non-contingent offer, broker recommends that prior to writing that offer, you review all available seller reports, disclosures, information, and documents. Have an appropriate professional inspect the property, even if being sold as is in its present condition, and carefully assess your financial position and risk with your attorney, accountant, or financial advisor. Multiple offers. At times, buyers may write offers on more than one property, even though buyer intends to purchase only one. Wah, wah, wah. This may occur in a short sale when the approval process may take a considerable amount of time, or could also occur in a hot market when buyers having difficulty getting an offer accepted. While it is not illegal to make offers on multiple properties with the intent of purchase only one, the buyer can be obligated to many sellers if more than one accepts the buyer's offer. Additionally, if any offer is accepted without contingencies and the buyer does not perform, there can be a breach. If the buyer has not disclosed that buyer is writing multiple offers with the intent to purchase only one, and the buyer subsequently cancels without using a contingency created for this purpose, the seller may claim that the buyer is in breach of contract because the buyer fraudulently induced the seller to enter into contract. This claim may even be possible when the buyer has all the standard contingencies remaining in the contract, as the seller could argue that the cancellation for this reason would not fall under good faith exercise of any of those contingencies. Okay, so just be advised of that. That's a good place for the multiple offers, especially if you're uncomfortable writing multiple offers, to make sure the buyer reads that paragraph. Any questions on the buyer's section of the market conditions advisory? All right, seller's considerations, right? So this section 3 is for sellers. As a seller, you are responsible for determining the asking price of your property, although brokers may provide you with comparable sales data, generally from information published in the local MLS. You should know that the reporting of this data is often delayed and prices may change up or down faster than the reported sales indicate. All sellers should ensure that they are comfortable with the asking price they are setting and the price they are accepting. There is not and cannot be any guarantee that the price you decide to ask for your property or the price at which you agree to sell your property is the highest available price obtainable for the property. It is solely your decision as to how much to ask for your property and to which price to sell your property. Buyer or seller acknowledges each has read, understand, and received a copy of this market conditions advisory. So that one, again, I include with all offers and with all listing agreements go out at the time that the buyer or seller is signing those forms, so that they can read this document ahead of time. In addition to that, when you go to send stuff out for signing, it allows you to reorder this. I always put this in front of that purchase agreement or the listing agreement, so they see this form before they move on to the listing or the purchase agreement. Any questions on the market conditions advisory? All right, our next form today is the statewide buyer and seller advisory. This is another one of those forms, even though it's like 14 pages long, that I do include with every offer and with every listing agreement. Again, I feel like this should be up front. I feel like the buyers and sellers should be aware of what's in this information before they sign that agreement, so they can go into it with an open mind of what's to come. Buyers' rights and duties are outlined at the beginning. It's got buyers, sellers, and brokers' rights. Right? So buyers, physical condition of the land and improvements being purchased are not guaranteed by sellers or brokers. You should conduct thorough investigations of the property, both personally and with appropriate professionals. If professionals recommend further inspections, you should contact qualified experts to conduct such inspections. You should retain your own professional, even if seller or broker has provided you with existing reports. You should read all written reports given to you and discuss those reports with the persons who prepared them. It is possible that different reports provided to you contain conflicting information. If there are discrepancies between reports, disclosures, or other information, you are responsible for contacting the appropriate professionals to confirm the accuracy of correctness of the reports, disclosures, and information. You have the right to request that the seller make repairs or corrections and take other actions based on the inspections or disclosures, but the seller is not obligated to respond to you or make such repairs, corrections, or other requested actions. If the seller is unwilling or unable to satisfy your request and you act within a certain period of time or within certain time periods, you may have the right to cancel the agreement, purchase agreement, or any other counteroffer or addendum together or not are the agreement. If you cancel outside these periods, you may be in breach of agreement and your deposit may be at risk. You are strongly advised to investigate the condition and suitability of all aspects of the property. If you do not do so, you are acting against the advice of brokers, right? So that's the buyer's duties. I think it's important for the buyer to read that up front. Seller's duties You have a duty to disclose the material facts known to you that affect the value or desirability of the property. You are obligated to make property available to the buyer and have utilities on for inspections as allowed by the agreement. Keep in mind that in the residential purchase agreement, it states that right where the investigation contingency is, it says something access. I can't come up with the word right now though. But that access, in fact, let's hold on. All right, California Residential Purchase Agreement in the grid, section L, where the contingencies are, right here. And informational access to the property, the 17 days that I normally extend to 30 days. That's that time period that the buyer has to access the property for any investigations, even if they've removed contingencies. Okay, so that's where that line item comes into play. All right, heading back to the statewide buyer and seller advisory. This form is not a substitute for completing the real estate transfer disclosure statement if required and other property specific questionnaires or disclosures. Brokers' rights and duties. Brokers do not have expertise in all areas and matters affecting the property or your evaluation of it. For the most sales, residential properties with no more than 4 units, brokers have a duty to make a reasonably competent and diligent visual inspection of the accessible areas of the property and disclose to you material facts or defects that inspection reveals. Many defects and conditions may not be discoverable by broker's visual inspection. If a broker gives a referral to another professional, brokers do not guarantee that person's performance. You may select any professional of your own choosing. If a broker gives you reports or other documents, unless otherwise specified, it is possible that different reports provided to you contain conflicting information. Broker has not and will not verify or otherwise investigate information contained therein. Any written agreement between broker and either buyer or seller or both establishes rights and responsibilities of those parties. Okay, so we've outlined everybody's duties. Legal, tax, and contract considerations for both buyer and seller, right? You're advised to seek the advice of authorized personnel. And then it goes through all the different types of inspections you can have on the property. And it's broken them in. It now gives us a table of contents, which we used to not have. It also breaks them into different sections. So pages 2 to 5 are the investigation of the physical condition. B is property use and ownership. C is off-site and neighborhood conditions, legal requirements, federal, state, and local. E is contract-related issues and terms. F is other factors affecting the property. And G is local disclosures and advisories. Okay, so this just gives us 15 pages. Right, we're already on page 2 here. Investigation of physical conditions. It lists all the different types of investigations that can be done affecting the physical conditions of the property. Right? Super in-depth report. So this is a good thing for buyers to have up front. In fact, this is a good document for buyers to sign and have at the time that you do the buyer consultation appointment. So that they have time to read and review this before you enter into contract on a property, but I still send it out every time I send out a purchase agreement. Property use and ownership, right? So it lists all the different inspections or investigations that can be around property use and ownership, off-site and neighborhood condition, golf course disclosures, neighborhood and personal factors, buyer's intended use, high-speed rail, smoking restrictions, neighborhood noise sources, schools, all these things are in here. There's 15 pages of different types of inspections and investigations buyers can do on property. Here on this local section here, that's where you'd put like Solano County disclosures and disclaimers advisory, or the Napa County disclosure, or the Placer County disclosure, right? You can list those there if they're in a property. If not, we just don't put anything in here. And what that does is there's nothing attached to this document. It still makes those part of the transaction because legally we have to provide those regional disclosures, but it's just not attached to the SBSA. And then your buyers or sellers sign this form. Any questions about this statewide buyer and seller advisory, SBSA? Okay, so that's one that I also include, like I said, market conditions advisory, statewide buyer and seller advisory, and the wildfire disaster advisory are all forms that I include with every offer. And I don't include this WDFA with a listing, but the MCA and the statewide buyer and seller go out with every listing agreement as well. This one just gets signed by the buyer. It really only pertains to the buyer, the wildfire disaster advisory. If you were on our class last week with Lisa Visa and her counterpart in the NHD world, we kind of touched on this wildfire disaster advisory and the fire hardening disclosure. So this one should go with every property in California at this time, because they're all truly considered in and around areas affected with wildfire. I can't think of any area in California that may not be affected by wildfire. So I include this with all buyer transactions with that offer. Talks about, hey, like as a result of the recent wildfire disasters, there are current and unresolved health and safety concerns related to the aftermath and cleanup of wildfire disasters, as well as unknown and potential future concerns related to the rebuilding of infrastructure in the affected areas of wildfires. Unfortunately, the impact of wildfires has not been limited to the fire areas themselves. Many areas have had air quality impacted by smoke and air particles from distant fires. Additionally, fires continue to occur in previously unaffected areas. See, we just covered all of California. Fires may be an issue throughout the state of California. Here, right, wildfire disaster and concern issues. The following non-extensive list represents concerns and issues that may impact buyers' decisions about purchasing or leasing property impacted by wildfire disaster, both concurrently and in the future. It is not intended to be, nor can it be, a checklist of all issues that might arise when purchasing or leasing property impacted by wildfire disasters. Concerns or issues include, but are not limited to, insurance, right? How hard is it to get insurance in California right now? Right? Insurance-related issues such as past claims, the importance of identifying insurability of the property, and the availability and cost of insurance as early in the process as possible. Lot clearing costs and requirements, whether the home has been fire hardened and to which extent, local, state, and federal requirements for cleanup and building approvals, air quality, soil quality, other environmental and personal health concerns, timelines, costs and requirements, availability of and access to electricity, gas, sewer, water, deliverability or potability, septic and or sewer design, potential redesign of streets or infrastructure. That's happening a lot, especially in Napa, because they're requiring like wider streets and driveways and stuff to be enlarged if you're rebuilding. Inconvenience and delays due to road construction and unavailability of various goods, the impact of federal, state, or local disaster declarations, right? So most of this doesn't apply to the majority of properties, but up here, insurance-related issues. That's going to apply to just about every property. You've got buyer advisories down here to check early in your transaction to determine if you're able to obtain insurance on the property, to investigate to their own satisfaction any and all concerns about the intended use of the property, that the area of wildfire disaster is likely to be under construction for a protracted period of time after a fire. You might be inconvenienced. Due to the extraordinary catastrophe of wildfire, there may be changes in various local, state, and federal laws, codes, requirements throughout the ongoing process of planning and rebuilding in wildfire disaster areas. That some insurers have reduced or canceled offerings of fire insurance or increased the costs that affect a buyer's ability to afford or qualify for loans or meet the income ratios. That if you are not able to obtain fire insurance and have removed property investigation or loan contingencies, you may be in breach of the purchase agreement, right? So if you haven't checked into it, you're not willing to pay whatever it takes to get that insurance, you may not want to remove the property investigation or loan contingencies. Property investigation, what would fall underneath there for insurability is number one, if it's insurable. Number two, if the price is too high and the buyer doesn't agree with the price of fire insurance, they could cancel under that investigation. Loan contingencies you could cancel if the buyer does no longer meet the ratios based on the monthly cost of the homeowners or fire insurance. So you've got two ways to cancel for fire insurance. One is more subjective. It's what the buyer is comfortable with. One is actual, like, can they still qualify with ratios? Resources below is a non-extensive list of all potential resources providing as a starting point for buyers' investigations and not as an endorsement or guarantee that any federal, state, city, county, or other resource will provide complete advice. And then it gives the list. Then it talks about the fire hardening and defensible space advisory. California law requires certain disclosures to be made concerning a property's compliance with safeguards that may minimize the risk of a structure on a property catching fire, fire hardening. And then an agreement to be reached concerning compliance with requirements that the surrounding structures be maintained to minimize the risk of the spread of wildfires, defensible space. The fire hardening and defensible space laws only apply if, among other requirements, the property is located in either a high or a very high fire hazard severity zone. Okay, where to locate information, talks about here. And then their acknowledgement. So fire leasing understands that the real estate agents and real estate brokers have no authority or expertise in providing guidance to the process of investigating the concerns described herein. Fire has an affirmative duty to exercise reasonable care in protecting themselves. Okay, any questions about the wildfire disaster advisory? All right, fabulous. So today we finished up the residential lease after sale, the RLAS. We covered the statewide buyer and seller advisory, that 15-page document that outlines all the different types of inspections that can be done. Our market conditions advisory, talking about the market being cyclical. That's also where you're going to find that paragraph about writing multiple offers that your buyers should read before writing multiple offers. We also talked about the wildfire disaster advisory. And as a bonus at the beginning, we also talked about the interim occupancy agreement. That's the buyer in possession of a property prior to the close of escrow. They're moving in before escrow closes, or the buyer pre-occupancy storage addendum. For storing their stuff in a property before the property closes. And we will go over both those forms in detail in April. So if you're looking for those forms in detail, we're going to go over them in April. Deborah, if you end up with questions on those forms, if you end up filling out either of those for your buyers, for your buyers for the property they're purchasing, if you need help, just holler at me and I'm happy to hop on a Zoom call or a phone call with you and answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Any other questions before we wrap up today? All right. Make sure you log your attendance. The link's in the chat box. My chat box is over there. It's actually over there. So that's why I point that way, but your chat box may not even be on. So turn your chat box on, click on that link, and it gives you an opportunity to make any suggestions for future trainings. And again, I'm putting together the April, May, June schedule right now. So if there's any trainings you would like to see, or any days that you would like to see trainings on instead of another day, put that recommendation in there as well. And I will see you tomorrow. We're going to be talking about your listing presentation. Last week, we talked about the pre-listing. And this week we will talk about the actual listing appointment. And then next week we're going to talk about listings contract close. Have a fabulous day.
Thank you. Bye.
You are welcome.